When a billionaire CEO decides to take a much-needed solo vacation, he unexpectedly falls for a mysterious woman. Soon after, he receives a text message from his wife that makes his heart stop. The sleek private jet touched down on the small airstrip just outside the seaside village of Fairhaven, a place Evan Archer had chosen with the same precision he applied to corporate acquisitions. Remote but not desolate, charming yet understated, the town promised the anonymity he craved. As the plane rolled to a stop, Evan felt the familiar pang of unease. Even in the quiet hum of success, his life was a cacophony: boardrooms, lawsuits, and a marriage teetering on the edge of collapse. For the first time in years, he wasn't running towards something but away from everything. The driver was waiting at the edge of the tarmac, leaning casually against an old black sedan. Evan threw a small duffel bag in the back seat and slid in without a word. He had no desire for conversation, and the driver, sensing this, left him to the silence. They wound their way down narrow roads flanked by towering pines until the forest thinned, revealing the shimmering blue of the ocean and the quaint sprawl of Fairhaven. Evan hadn't planned anything beyond arriving. The idea of structure, even in his downtime, felt suffocating. The town welcomed him with its cobblestone streets and pastel-colored buildings, which glowed warmly in the late afternoon light. A sea breeze carried hints of salt and lavender, as if the town itself had been scrubbed clean of anything resembling stress or ambition. Checking into a modest inn, he offered a quick nod to the receptionist and climbed the creaking stairs to his room. Inside, Evan set his phone on the nightstand. It felt unnatural, almost reckless, to leave it there and not in his hand, but that was the point. Mila's texts, terse and icy, had been relentless since he'd left. He didn't bother reading them now. He stared out the window for a moment, watching the waves roll in like clockwork, unhurried and indifferent to the lives they framed. Something in their rhythm felt almost therapeutic, like an invitation to let go. Fairhaven came alive in the evening with a quiet hum of life. Families dined together at the small seaside bistros, couples strolled hand in hand along the boardwalk, and the faint sound of a street performer's guitar drifted through the air. Evan wandered aimlessly, blending into the crowd for once, his presence unnoticed and unremarkable. His tailored clothes and carefully groomed appearance made him stand out back in the city, but here he could just be another traveler passing through. He liked that. Stopping at a small cafe tucked away on a side street, Evan stepped inside and ordered a coffee. He sat at a table by the window, sipping the drink and watching the soft glow of the streetlights illuminate the cobblestones. It was then he noticed her. She walked past the cafe with an effortless grace, her dark hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. Her dress, simple and flowing, seemed to dance with the breeze. Evan couldn't pinpoint what it was that caught his attention, perhaps the way she carried herself, as though the world had no claim on her, or the faint smile that lingered on her lips, as if she knew something no one else did. Before he realized it, she turned her head, her eyes locking with his through the glass. Her gaze was calm, unreadable, and yet it seemed to pierce right through him. A flicker of something crossed her face, recognition, maybe curiosity, before she continued down the street and out of sight. Evan sat frozen, the moment lingering like the aftertaste of his coffee. He shook his head, chastising himself for the ridiculousness of it. People exchanged glances every day, and it meant nothing. But as he left the cafe and wandered back to the inn, her image stayed with him, vivid and undeniable. The next morning, Evan decided to explore more of Fairhaven. He had no meetings, no deadlines, no emails clamoring for his attention. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt the absence of purpose. It was unnerving at first, like standing on a ledge with no clear way forward, but the simplicity of the town offered a strange kind of comfort. He found himself at the local market, a colorful sprawl of stalls selling everything from fresh seafood to handmade trinkets. As he browsed aimlessly, he heard a familiar voice, a soft, lilting tone that drew his attention like a magnet. Turning, he saw her again. She was at a nearby stall, inspecting a small silver bracelet. Up close, she was even more striking, her features delicate yet defined. There was a natural elegance to her movements, as though every gesture was deliberate yet unforced. Evan hesitated, torn between the impulse to approach her and the fear of coming across as just another stranger with misplaced intentions. Before he could decide, she looked up and caught his eye. This time, her smile was unmistakable, a subtle, almost playful curve of her lips. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, holding up the bracelet. Evan cleared his throat, momentarily caught off guard. "It is. A little understated, but that's what makes it special." She raised an eyebrow, her smile deepening. "You have an eye for detail. Occupational hazard," he replied, his own smile forming. "I'm Evan." "Celeste," she said, extending her hand. Her touch was cool and soft, her grip firm but unassuming. They talked for a few minutes, the conversation flowing easily despite their brief acquaintance. Celeste had a way of making the mundane seem fascinating, her observations laced with humor and insight. Evan found himself captivated, not just by her beauty but by the energy she seemed to carry, a quiet confidence, unburdened by the need to impress. As they parted ways, Celeste gave him a small wave, her expression unreadable once again. Evan watched her disappear into the crowd, a strange mixture of curiosity and excitement stirring within him. Returning to the inn, he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths were destined to cross again. For the first time in years, he felt something beyond the suffocating weight of his responsibilities, something raw, unfiltered, and thrilling. What he didn't realize was that his carefully planned escape had set something into motion, a chain of events that would unravel his life in ways he couldn't yet fathom. Evan spent the rest of the day lost in thought, replaying his brief interaction with Celeste. It wasn't like him to dwell on someone he'd just met, much less a stranger in a quiet seaside town he'd come to escape from everything and everyone. But there was something about her, an air of mystery, a quiet strength, that made it impossible to forget. He caught himself glancing out the window of his inn room more than once, wondering if she might pass by. The rational part of him dismissed it as a fleeting infatuation, but another part, one he hadn't felt in years, held on to the hope of seeing her again. The following morning, after a restless night, Evan decided to return to the cafe where he'd first noticed her. It was a slim chance, but Fairhaven wasn't a sprawling city. If she lived here, she might show up again. He told himself it was purely coincidence when he stepped inside and saw her seated at a table near the window, sipping from a porcelain cup and reading a book. Her presence seemed to pull the air out of the room. The sunlight streaming through the window caught the delicate angles of her face, highlighting her features in a way that seemed almost unreal. She wore a soft cardigan over her dress, her hair loosely tied back, as though she hadn't planned on impressing anyone, yet she managed to command attention effortlessly. Evan hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should approach. He was a stranger here, and the last thing he wanted was to come across as intrusive. But as if sensing his internal debate, Celeste looked up from her book and met his gaze. A flicker of recognition passed over her face, followed by a small smile that was equal parts welcoming and enigmatic. "Back for the coffee?" she asked as he approached, her voice carrying the same lilting tone he remembered. "Something like that," Evan replied, gesturing toward the seat opposite her. "Do you mind?" She closed her book with a soft thud and set it aside. "Not at all. It's rare to see familiar faces around here, even if they're strangers." Evan took a seat, suddenly aware of how deliberate his actions felt under her steady gaze. "I guess I stand out. In a town like this?" "Definitely," she said, her lips curving into a faint smirk. "But in a good way. Let me guess, you're not here for the fishing or the pottery classes." "Not exactly," Evan admitted, laughing softly. "I needed a change of pace. This place seemed like the perfect escape." Celeste tilted her head, studying him with an expression that was both curious and knowing. "Escape from what, though?" Evan hesitated. The truth, that he was running from the suffocating weight of his career and the ashes of his marriage, felt too personal to share with someone he barely knew. But there was something disarming about her, a quiet sincerity that made him want to answer honestly. "Everything," he finally said. "Work, life. All of it." Her smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of understanding. Fairhaven's good for that. It has a way of making you forget what you're running from, at least for a little while. There was a sadness in her voice, subtle but unmistakable. Evan's curiosity deepened. You sound like someone speaking from experience. She shrugged, her gaze drifting out the window. Maybe. But forgetting doesn't mean things go away, does it? Evan leaned back in his chair, watching her. She was reserved, careful with her words, but there was an undercurrent of vulnerability beneath her calm exterior. It was like watching waves crash against a rocky shore, quietly powerful, yet always in motion. Their conversation shifted to lighter topics, the town's charm, the local food, the eccentricities of the villagers. Celeste spoke with a dry wit that caught Evan off guard more than once, making him laugh in a way he hadn't in years. She was intelligent, insightful, and refreshingly unpretentious, a stark contrast to the polished and calculated interactions he was used to in his world. Still, she remained elusive about herself, sidestepping questions about her background with practiced ease. When Evan asked how long she'd been in Fairhaven, she replied with a vague, "Long enough to appreciate its quirks." When he inquired about her work, she simply said, "I do a little bit of everything," with a smile that suggested she wasn't going to elaborate. "Not everything is as it seems," she said at one point, her tone light but her words lingering in the air like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Evan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She took a sip of her tea, her gaze meeting his. "Just that this town has its secrets, like anywhere else. And sometimes people come here to be someone they're not." He studied her, wondering if the comment was meant for him, or if it was a glimpse into her own story. Before he could press further, she glanced at her watch and stood. "I should get going," she said, gathering her book and bag. "It was nice talking to you, Evan." "You too," he replied, standing as well. "Maybe I'll see you around." "Maybe," she said with a faint smile, and then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd outside as effortlessly as she had appeared. Evan sat back down, staring at the spot where she'd been. There was something about Celeste that he couldn't quite put his finger on, a contradiction that both intrigued and unsettled him. She was warm yet guarded, open yet mysterious. He found himself wanting to know more, to uncover the layers she seemed so intent on hiding. As he left the cafe and wandered through the town, he couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter was more than just chance. Celeste's words echoed in his mind. Not everything is as it seems. What wasn't as it seemed? The town? The people? Or her? The questions hung in the air like a mist, impossible to ignore. Evan had come to Fairhaven seeking escape, but now he felt like he was being drawn into something far more complex than he'd anticipated. And despite the uncertainty, a part of him didn't want to turn back. The days that followed felt like a dream Evan wasn't ready to wake from. He had come to Fairhaven expecting solitude, but Celeste's presence had shifted something within him. She wasn't just an intriguing stranger anymore. She had become a constant, her laughter and sharp wit lingering in his mind long after their encounters ended. It started simply. Another run-in at the market led to a walk along the winding paths by the cliffs, the ocean stretching endlessly before them. Celeste talked about the natural beauty of the town, pointing out the wildflowers and explaining how the tides shaped the shoreline. Evan listened, not because he cared about coastal geography but because the sound of her voice had a way of grounding him, pulling him out of his restless thoughts. By the third day, their chance meetings began to feel intentional. They shared coffee at the cafe again, this time lingering long after their cups had gone cold. Celeste talked about her love for books, mentioning an old bookstore tucked away on the edge of town. Evan suggested they visit together, and she agreed with a playful smile that sent his heart racing in a way he hadn't felt in years. The bookstore was as charming as Celeste had described, with creaky wooden floors and shelves crammed so tightly with books that navigating them felt like exploring a labyrinth. She seemed completely at home there, running her fingers along the spines and pulling out titles to show him. Evan followed her lead, but his attention was more on her than the books. She had a way of lighting up when she talked about something she loved, and he found himself hanging on her every word. You don't strike me as the type to get lost in novels, she teased, holding up a battered copy of The Old Man and the Sea. Evan smirked. Why's that? You seem too pragmatic. Like you'd rather read business strategies than fiction. You're not wrong, he admitted. But maybe I've been missing out. Celeste raised an eyebrow, her expression turning serious for a moment. Books let you escape without running. Maybe you should try it sometime. Her words struck a chord, and Evan felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. He wondered if she had said it intentionally, knowing more about him than she let on, or if it was just another glimpse of the depths she tried to keep hidden. As they left the bookstore, Celeste surprised him by suggesting they visit the harbor. The sun was beginning to set, casting the town in hues of gold and pink. They walked along the docks, the gentle rocking of the boats, and the cries of seagulls creating a soundtrack that felt almost cinematic. She pointed out the different types of vessels, her knowledge of the sea surprising him. You know a lot about boats, he said, leaning against the railing and watching her. I grew up near the water, she replied, her voice quieter than before. It feels like home. There was a wistfulness in her tone that made Evan want to ask more, but he held back. She had a way of dodging questions about herself, and he didn't want to ruin the moment. Instead, he changed the subject, telling her about the first time he'd been on a yacht, a corporate event that had felt more like a cage than a celebration. Celeste laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Sounds awful. It was, Evan said, smiling despite himself. But this is different. They fell into a comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Evan felt a warmth spreading through him, a quiet contentment that he hadn't experienced in years. It was strange and intoxicating, and he wasn't sure if it was the town or Celeste, or both. But as the days passed, the pull of reality began to creep back in. Every time he caught sight of his phone on the nightstand, a pang of guilt twisted in his chest. Mila's texts had slowed but hadn't stopped entirely. Her last message was burned into his mind. We need to talk when you're back. He knew what she meant. Their marriage had been unraveling for years, the distance between them growing with every missed dinner and unspoken argument. His decision to leave for Fairhaven under the guise of a business retreat was a symptom of a larger problem, a problem he wasn't ready to face. And yet here he was, spending his days with Celeste, laughing with her, sharing pieces of himself he hadn't shared with anyone in years. It felt wrong and right at the same time, a contradiction he couldn't reconcile. He told himself it was harmless, that he wasn't doing anything more than enjoying her company. But deep down, he knew the truth was more complicated. Celeste, for her part, seemed to sense his inner conflict. She never pried, but there were moments when her gaze lingered on him, as if she could see the weight he was carrying. It made him wonder what burdens she hid behind her enigmatic smile. One evening, as they walked along the cliffs again, he finally asked, Why are you here, Celeste? She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. What do you mean? Fairhaven. It doesn't seem like the kind of place people just end up. She hesitated, her steps slowing. I needed a fresh start, she said finally. Sometimes you have to step away from everything to figure out what matters. Her words echoed his own reasoning for coming here, but there was something in her tone that made him think there was more to the story. He wanted to press her, to understand what she was running from, but the guarded look in her eyes stopped him. You're right, he said instead. It's the perfect place for that. Celeste smiled faintly, but the sadness he'd glimpsed before was back, like a shadow she couldn't quite shake. They walked in silence for a while, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. Evan couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so at ease with someone. With Celeste, there was no pretense, no expectations. She didn't care about his wealth or his status, and that made him feel more human than he had in years. But as the sun set and the sky turned to twilight, the questions he'd been avoiding loomed larger. What was he doing? How long could he stay in this limbo, pretending that Fairhaven and Celeste existed in a vacuum separate from the rest of his life? And why did the thought of leaving her feel so much harder than it should? The days blurred into each other in Fairhaven, a rhythm Evan hadn't known he needed. Mornings were spent wandering the market or the quiet streets, afternoons turned into long walks with Celeste along the cliffs, and evenings often ended at the small cafe where their conversations grew deeper with each passing day. Celeste's guarded nature softened as they spent more time together. She began to share fragments of her past, how she loved the ocean because it reminded her of the summers she spent with her grandmother in a similar seaside town, or how she'd once dreamed of being a marine biologist, but life had steered her in a different direction. Evan, too, found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected, telling her about his restless ambition and the cracks in his marriage he tried to ignore for years. But even as they grew closer, a quiet tension hummed beneath the surface. Evan couldn't stop thinking about Mila's last message or the weight of the choices he had left behind. And Celeste, though warm and present, still kept parts of herself locked away, as though afraid to reveal too much. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting golden light across the town, Celeste suggested they visit the beach. It was quieter than the bustling harbor, a stretch of sand framed by jagged cliffs and the endless expanse of the ocean. Evan agreed, eager for the calm it promised but also drawn to the way her eyes lit up at the idea. They walked along the shore as the waves lapped at their feet, the sand cool and soft beneath them. Celeste had kicked off her shoes and was carrying them in one hand, her other occasionally brushing against Evan's as they walked. The sun hung low on the horizon, its reflection shimmering on the water like molten gold. "This is my favorite time of day," Celeste said, her voice quiet. "The in-between. Not quite day, not quite night. It feels like anything's possible." Evan glanced at her, the soft glow of the setting sun catching in her hair and illuminating her face. "You're right," he said. "It does." They found a spot near a cluster of rocks and sat down, the ocean stretching endlessly before them. Celeste drew her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them as she watched the waves roll in. Evan leaned back on his hands, letting the salty breeze wash over him. "I've spent so much time chasing things," Evan said after a while, his voice low. "Success, money, approval. And yet, sitting here, it feels like none of it matters." Celeste turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "It matters, Evan. Just not in the way you think. You're allowed to want more than what you have, but maybe it's not about chasing. Maybe it's about finding." "Finding what?" he asked, genuinely curious. She smiled faintly, her gaze drifting back to the ocean. "That's the part you have to figure out." Her words struck a chord, resonating in a way Evan couldn't fully articulate. For so long, he had defined himself by his accomplishments, his status, his ability to control every aspect of his life. But here, in this quiet town with this enigmatic woman, he felt untethered from all of it. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. Evan found himself stealing glances at Celeste, the way the fading light danced across her features, the serenity in her expression. She seemed almost otherworldly, like a figure from a dream. "Celeste," he said softly, breaking the silence. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his. There was something unspoken in the air, a magnetic pull that neither of them could deny. Evan leaned closer, his heart pounding, and for a moment he hesitated, afraid of crossing a line he couldn't uncross. But then she closed the distance, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was both gentle and electrifying. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was a quiet affirmation of the connection they had built, an unspoken acknowledgement of the feelings they had both tried to suppress. When they pulled apart, the world seemed to hold its breath. Celeste smiled, a softness in her eyes that Evan hadn't seen before. He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers, and for the first time in years he felt a sense of peace. They stayed on the beach until the stars began to appear, talking about everything and nothing. Celeste told him about the constellations her grandmother had taught her, pointing them out in the night sky. Evan shared stories from his childhood, moments he hadn't thought about in years but that felt safe to share with her. As the evening wore on, a quiet understanding settled between them. There were no declarations of love, no promises for the future, but there didn't need to be. In that moment, under the vast expanse of the night sky, they were simply two people who had found something rare and fleeting. When they finally stood to leave, Evan couldn't help but feel like he had stepped into another world, one where the weight of his responsibilities didn't exist, where he could breathe freely for the first time in years. Walking back to the town with Celeste by his side, her hand still in his, he felt a warmth in his chest that he couldn't quite explain. But as they reached the edge of the town and Celeste bid him goodnight, disappearing into the shadows of the cobblestone streets, a familiar unease crept back in. The guilt, the unanswered questions, the life he had temporarily left behind, they all loomed on the horizon, waiting for him to face them. For now, though, Evan allowed himself to hold on to the moment. He lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in years, he felt genuinely alive. The world outside Fairhaven seemed distant, almost unreal, and as sleep finally claimed him, he clung to the hope that this fragile sense of freedom could last just a little longer. Evan woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains, the sound of seagulls faintly calling from the harbor. For a moment, he lay there in a state of serene disorientation, the memory of the previous evening lingering like a warm afterglow. Celeste's laughter, the taste of her kiss, the way her hand had fit so perfectly in his, it all felt surreal, like a scene from a movie he didn't want to end. But reality came crashing back as he turned to grab his phone, still on the nightstand where he had left it. The screen lit up with a single unread text from Mila. His heart sank before he even opened it, the weight of his other life pulling him back into its grasp. "Evan, I know what you're doing. Come home immediately, or you'll regret it." The words stared back at him, stark and unforgiving. His mind raced. How could she possibly know? He hadn't told anyone where he was going, not even his assistant, and Mila rarely took an interest in his whereabouts anymore, unless it was to confront him about another missed anniversary or a poorly disguised lie. But this was different. There was an edge to her message that he hadn't seen before, a threat laced within her usual tone of icy detachment. He sat up, his chest tightening as he tried to piece together what could have led her to send it. Had she hired someone to track him? That seemed far-fetched, but then again, Mila wasn't one to let things go quietly. Their marriage had been a series of increasingly strained negotiations, each of them too proud to walk away yet too weary to try and fix what had long since broken. The thought of returning home felt unbearable. For the first time in years, he had found something real, something that made him feel alive again. But now, that fragile sense of freedom was under threat, and the illusion of his escape was crumbling faster than he could hold it together. A soft knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He set the phone down and opened the door to find Celeste standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee. She smiled, though her expression faltered slightly as she took in his disheveled state. "Good morning," she said, handing him a cup. "I thought you could use this." "Thanks," he murmured, forcing a smile. He stepped aside to let her in, suddenly hyper-aware of the phone still sitting on the nightstand, the text message glaring like an accusation. Celeste glanced around the room, her eyes lingering on him for a moment. "You okay? You seem off." Evan hesitated, torn between the urge to confide in her and the instinct to keep his turmoil to himself. He took a sip of the coffee, the warmth doing little to calm his nerves. "Just a rough morning," he said finally. "Didn't sleep well." Celeste nodded, though her expression remained unreadable. "Well, maybe some fresh air will help. I was thinking we could take the ferry to the little island off the coast. It's quiet, and the views are amazing." The suggestion was tempting, but Evan couldn't shake the weight of Mila's message. He nodded anyway, hoping the distraction might give him some clarity. "Sounds perfect," he said, managing a small smile. As they walked through the town toward the ferry, Celeste filled the silence with light conversation, pointing out quirky details about Fairhaven he hadn't noticed before. But Evan's responses were clipped, his mind consumed by the text. He kept glancing at his phone, half expecting another message from Mila, something that might explain her cryptic threat. Celeste must have noticed his distraction because she eventually fell quiet, her easy demeanor shifting into something more reserved. When they boarded the ferry, she leaned against the railing, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You don't have to pretend with me, you know," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the wind. "If something's bothering you, just say it." Evan hesitated, the urge to tell her clashing with the fear of what her reaction might be. Would she understand? Or would she pull away, realizing the mess he was bringing into her life? "It's complicated," he said finally, his voice low. "There's someone in my life. Someone I've been trying to leave behind, but it's not that simple." Celeste turned to look at him, her expression calm but guarded. "Your wife," she said, more a statement than a question. Evan's stomach tightened. He hadn't explicitly mentioned Mila before, though he suspected Celeste had pieced it together. "Yes," he admitted. "Things haven't been right between us for a long time. I told myself this trip was about clearing my head, figuring out what I want. But now she's reaching out." Celeste finished, her tone neutral. Evan nodded, feeling a pang of guilt at her composure. "She sent me a message this morning. It's not like her. There was something off about it." Celeste studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his. "And you're worried about what it means?" "Exactly," Evan said, the tension in his chest easing slightly at her understanding. Celeste turned back to the horizon, her hair blowing in the wind. "You're not the first person to come to Fairhaven to escape," she said after a long silence. "But the thing about running is that it only works for so long. Eventually, whatever you're running from catches up." Her words hit harder than Evan wanted to admit. He knew she was right, but he wasn't ready to face what it all meant, not for Mila, not for Celeste, and not for himself. The ferry docked at the island, and they spent the afternoon wandering its rugged trails and quiet beaches. Celeste seemed to sense his need for space, keeping the conversation light and avoiding anything too personal. But her distance only fueled Evan's unease. Was she pulling away because of his confession? Or was there something else she wasn't telling him? As they returned to Fairhaven that evening, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that his world was unraveling faster than he could control. Mila's message, Celeste's cryptic remarks, and the weight of his own choices all loomed over him like a storm waiting to break. Back in his room, he stared at his phone, torn between ignoring Mila's text and calling her to demand an explanation. But no matter what he chose, he knew one thing for certain: the escape he had sought in Fairhaven was slipping through his fingers, and the life he had left behind was closer than ever to pulling him back in. Evan spent most of the night staring at his phone, Mila's message playing over and over in his mind. Sleep was elusive, and every time he closed his eyes, he pictured her face, calm, calculating, and always 2 steps ahead. He had underestimated her before, but this time felt different. Her words weren't just angry. They were deliberate, almost surgical in their intent to unsettle him. By morning, the unease had transformed into a simmering need for answers. Mila wasn't one to act on impulse. If she knew where he was, there had to be a reason, a trail he hadn't seen. He couldn't shake the possibility that someone had told her. But who? He hadn't spoken to anyone in Fairhaven about his life back home, except Celeste. The thought hit him like a jolt of electricity. Celeste. Could she have said something? His rational mind rejected the idea. She had no reason to betray him. And yet, there had been moments, her careful deflections, the way she avoided questions about her past, that now felt like pieces of a larger puzzle he couldn't ignore. Evan decided to retrace his steps, searching for any clue as to how Mila could have found him. He scrolled through his phone, checking for apps that might have shared his location. Nothing seemed out of place. His credit card statements? Unlikely. He'd been careful to use cash since arriving. Every angle he explored came up empty, leaving him with only one lingering doubt. That afternoon, as he walked through the town, he couldn't stop replaying his time with Celeste. He thought about her cryptic comment on the ferry. Running only works for so long. At the time, it had felt like wisdom born from experience. Now, it felt like something more. A warning, maybe even a veiled confession. When he reached the cafe where they often met, Celeste was already there, seated at their usual table. She looked up and smiled as he approached, but there was something in her expression, an edge he hadn't noticed before. "Morning," she said, her tone light. "You look like you didn't sleep much." "I didn't," Evan admitted, sitting across from her. "Too much on my mind." Celeste tilted her head, studying him. "Still thinking about that message?" He nodded, watching her carefully. "I can't figure out how she found me. I've been so careful." Celeste leaned back in her chair, her smile fading. "Maybe she's just good at guessing. People like her usually are." The words struck a nerve, but Evan pushed past it. "Or maybe someone told her." Her gaze flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough. A pit formed in his stomach as a question he didn't want to ask forced its way out. "Did you tell her?" he said, his voice quieter than he'd intended. Celeste's eyes widened, her expression a mix of shock and hurt. "What? Of course not. Why would you even think that?" Evan hesitated, guilt warring with suspicion. "I don't know. It's just. There's no other explanation." Celeste's jaw tightened, and for the first time since they'd met, he saw anger flash in her eyes. "You think I'd betray you? After everything we've shared?" The conviction in her voice made him doubt himself, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. "I don't want to think that. But Mila doesn't make idle threats. If she knows where I am, it's because someone told her." Celeste stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "You're right. She doesn't make idle threats." The words sent a chill down Evan's spine. He leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What are you saying?" Celeste looked away, her hands gripping the edge of the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost reluctant. "I know Mila." Evan froze, the air seeming to leave the room. "You? What?" "She contacted me before you came here," Celeste said, her eyes filled with something between guilt and resignation. "She told me you were planning to leave for a while, and she asked me to keep an eye on you." The words hit Evan like a blow. His mind reeled, trying to process what she was saying. "Why? Why would she do that?" "She wanted to see if you'd stay loyal," Celeste said, her voice trembling slightly. "She didn't think you would." Evan stared at her, his chest tight. "And what about you? Were you working for her this whole time?" Celeste shook her head quickly, tears glistening in her eyes. "No. At first I thought it was just a job. But then I got to know you, and everything changed. I wasn't supposed to care, but I stopped," Evan said, cutting her off. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You lied to me. This whole time, you were lying." "I wasn't lying," Celeste said, her voice breaking. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to lose what we had. I didn't expect to feel this way about you." Evan backed away, his mind racing. Every moment they'd shared suddenly felt tainted, every laugh, every kiss, all part of a scheme he hadn't seen coming. He turned and walked out of the cafe, ignoring Celeste's voice calling after him. Back at the inn, he paced the small room, his emotions a chaotic mess of anger, betrayal, and something he couldn't quite name. He thought about Mila, her cold precision, the way she always seemed to manipulate situations to her advantage. This was her doing, all of it. But Celeste. She had made a choice. She could have told him the truth, but she didn't. Yet, as the initial wave of anger subsided, another thought crept in. What if Celeste was telling the truth? What if her feelings for him were real, despite how they'd started? The idea only made things more complicated, and he didn't know whether to trust his instincts or shut them out completely. By the time the sun set, Evan felt like he was no closer to answers than he'd been that morning. All he knew was that the escape he'd found in Fairhaven was gone, and he wasn't sure what was left in its place. Evan spent the night wrestling with his thoughts, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. Celeste's confession echoed in his mind, her voice trembling with what might have been sincerity. But how could he believe her? How could he separate the truth from the lies when the entire foundation of their connection had been built on deception? By morning, he couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. He needed answers, not just from Celeste, but from Mila as well. He dressed quickly and left the inn, heading toward the cafe where he knew Celeste would be. His emotions churned, anger, confusion, and a flicker of something he couldn't name, something that refused to let him simply walk away. Celeste was there, sitting at the same table as the day before. Her expression was drawn, her usual calm replaced by visible tension. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Evan," she said softly, standing as he reached the table. "I save it," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "We're past small talk." Her face fell, but she nodded, gesturing for him to sit. He remained standing, his arms crossed, his gaze unwavering. "I need the truth," he said. "All of it. No more half-answers, no more dodging." Celeste took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You already know most of it," she began. "Mila contacted me a few weeks ago. She said you'd be coming here and that she wanted someone to keep an eye on you, to see if you'd stray." Evan's jaw tightened. "And you agreed? Why?" "At first, it was just about the money," Celeste admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was in a bad place, and it seemed harmless. Just talk to you, report back. But then I met you, and it wasn't harmless anymore. You could have told me," Evan said, his voice hard. "You had every opportunity to come clean." "I was afraid," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Afraid you'd hate me, that you'd walk away. And by the time I realized how much you meant to me, it felt too late. I thought I could fix it somehow." Evan's heart twisted at her words, but he refused to let himself soften. "And Mila? What does she want from all this? Just to catch me slipping?" Celeste hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. "It's more than that. She's afraid, Evan. Of losing control, of losing you. She said she wanted to protect what you two had, but I think it's about power. She doesn't want to feel powerless." Evan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door to the cafe swung open, and Mila walked in. She was a vision of composed fury, her perfectly tailored coat and meticulously styled hair a stark contrast to the casual charm of Fairhaven. Her eyes locked onto Evan and Celeste, and a cold smile curved her lips. "Well," Mila said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Isn't this cozy?" Evan stood, his body tensing as Mila approached the table. Celeste remained seated, her face pale but resolute. "Mila," Evan said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "What are you doing here? I thought it was time we had a little chat." Mila replied, her gaze flickering briefly to Celeste before returning to Evan. "You've been avoiding me, and I don't appreciate being ignored." Evan crossed his arms, his frustration boiling over. "Maybe because you sent someone to spy on me. Care to explain that?" Mila's smile tightened. "I didn't spy on you, Evan. I protected us. Or at least I tried to." "Protected us?" Evan said, his voice rising. "By hiring her to test me? To see if I'd fail some arbitrary loyalty test?" Mila's composure wavered for a moment, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her face. "You've been pulling away for years, Evan. Always working, always distant. I needed to know if there was still something worth saving." Evan shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "And this is how you chose to find out? By manipulating me? By dragging her into this?" Mila's eyes narrowed, her tone turning defensive. "Don't act like you're blameless. You left, Evan. You abandoned me, our marriage, without even trying to fix it. Because it was broken," Evan shot back. "And instead of talking to me, you decided to orchestrate this charade." The cafe had grown silent, the few patrons watching the scene unfold with poorly hidden curiosity. Celeste finally stood, her voice quiet but firm. "Stop," she said, looking between them. Both of you. This isn't solving anything. Mila turned to Celeste, her expression icy. You don't get to play the mediator. You're just as guilty in this as he is. I know, Celeste said, her voice steady despite the accusation. And I'm sorry. For everything. But this isn't about me. It's about you too. You need to figure out what you want, without me in the middle. Evan stared at her, a lump forming in his throat. Despite everything, there was a strength in her words that made it harder to hold on to his anger. But Mila's presence loomed large, her frustration radiating like a storm cloud. Evan, Mila said, her voice softening. I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it because I still care. I still want us to work, even if you don't see it. Evan looked at her, his chest tightening with the weight of her words. Then he turned to Celeste, whose eyes were filled with a mixture of regret and something that looked dangerously close to hope. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. Two paths stretched out before him, each carrying its own risks and consequences. To return to Mila meant trying to salvage something that had been unraveling for years, but it also meant security, familiarity, and the possibility of healing. To take a chance on Celeste meant embracing uncertainty, trusting that her feelings were real despite the betrayal, and risking everything for the hope of something new. The choice wasn't easy. It wasn't supposed to be. But as Evan looked between the two women, he realized that the decision he made now would define not just his future, but the man he wanted to become. The cafe was silent except for the faint clinking of a spoon against a coffee cup. Evan stood at the center of the storm, caught between two women who had upended his carefully controlled world. Mila, the woman he had once promised to build a life with, stood rigidly composed, her gaze imploring yet tinged with anger. Celeste, the enigmatic stranger who had made him feel alive again, looked at him with a mixture of hope and resignation. He exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Mila's words still hung in the air, her admission of fear, of wanting to salvage what was left of their marriage. There was truth in what she'd said. Their relationship had unraveled over years of mutual neglect, both of them complicit in its decline. But standing there, facing her, Evan realized that what they'd once had was beyond repair. It wasn't anger or betrayal that fueled his decision, it was clarity. They had simply grown into two different people, and no amount of effort could bridge the gulf that had formed between them. Mila, Evan began, his voice steady but soft. I can't give you the answer you want. I've been running from this for years, but the truth is, I've already let go. We've both been holding on to something that doesn't exist anymore. Her face hardened, a flicker of pain breaking through her composed exterior. So that's it. You're just done? It's not about being done, Evan said, his tone calm. It's about being honest, with you and with myself. We deserve better than this half-life we've been living. Mila's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes glistening. She opened her mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she gave a curt nod, turning away as if retreating was her only way to keep her dignity intact. Without another word, she walked out of the cafe, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Evan watched her go, his heart heavy with the finality of it all. He had thought this moment would feel liberating, but instead, it felt like the closing of a chapter he hadn't fully prepared to end. When he turned back to Celeste, she was watching him, her expression unreadable. You didn't have to do that for me, she said quietly. I never wanted to come between you two. It wasn't for you, Evan replied, his voice firm. It was for me. Celeste nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the table. And now? Evan took a step closer, his heart pounding. Now I want to stop running. I don't know what's ahead, and I don't have all the answers, but I know one thing, I can't imagine walking away from you. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked as though she didn't trust what she was hearing. After everything? After what I did? You made a mistake, Evan said, his voice softening. But so did I. I let myself get lost in my own fears and failures. You helped me see that I don't have to live that way anymore, Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, a small, tentative smile breaking through. "You're sure about this?" He reached out, taking her hand in his. "I've never been more sure of anything." The words felt right in a way nothing else had in years. For the first time, Evan wasn't making a choice out of obligation or fear. He was choosing a path that aligned with the person he wanted to be, someone who could embrace uncertainty and take a chance on happiness. Later that evening, Evan and Celeste walked along the beach, the waves glowing under the moonlight. They talked about everything: her guilt over Mila's scheme, his regrets about the life he had left behind, and the fragile hope they both felt for the future. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was honest, and that was enough. As dawn approached, Celeste fell silent, her head resting on Evan's shoulder as they watched the horizon. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the water, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Evan stood, letting the cool ocean breeze wash over him, and for the first time in years, he felt truly present. The road ahead was uncertain, but it no longer scared him. He had made his choice, not just to embrace Celeste, but to embrace life on his own terms. The mistakes of his past would always be a part of him, but they didn't have to define him. He could move forward, step by step, and build something new. As the sun rose higher, Evan turned to Celeste, her face glowing in the morning light. "Let's see where this goes," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. She smiled, her eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and hope. "I'd like that." Hand in hand, they walked along the shore, the waves crashing gently at their feet. The town of Fairhaven, with all its secrets and serendipities, faded into the background as they looked ahead, ready to face whatever came next. For Evan, it wasn't about where the path would lead, it was about taking the first step, finally free from the shadows of his past. In the days that followed, Evan and Celeste settled into an uneasy but hopeful rhythm. Their connection remained strong, but the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air, unspoken but ever-present. Mila had left Fairhaven without another word, and though Evan didn't regret his decision, he couldn't help but wonder what ripples it might create in the life he'd left behind. Evan spent his mornings walking the cliffs alone, letting the crisp ocean air clear his thoughts. It was during these walks that he began to truly reflect on what he wanted his life to look like moving forward. His career, once the driving force behind every decision he made, now felt distant, almost irrelevant. The choices he'd made to build his empire had come at the expense of so much else: his happiness, his relationships, even his sense of self. He wasn't sure what his next step would be, but he knew one thing for certain: it wouldn't be a return to the man he used to be. Celeste, too, seemed changed by the events of the past week. She was more open now, her walls gradually coming down as she shared more about her life. Evan learned about the hardships she had faced, the losses, the compromises, and the regrets that had led her to Fairhaven. It was a story that mirrored his own in some ways, and it deepened his admiration for her resilience. One afternoon, as they sat on the beach watching the tide roll in, Celeste broke the comfortable silence between them. "Do you ever think about what happens next?" she asked, her voice soft but thoughtful. Evan glanced at her, the question catching him off guard. "All the time," he admitted. "But I'm trying not to plan too much. For once, I just want to see where life takes me." She smiled at that, her fingers tracing patterns in the sand. "I like that. It's hard though, isn't it? Letting go of control. Hard doesn't even begin to cover it," he said with a laugh. "But it's worth it. I've spent so much of my life trying to control everything, and look where it got me." Celeste's smile faded slightly, her gaze turning serious. "And what about her? Mila?" Evan sighed, leaning back on his hands. "She deserved better than what I gave her. But we both stayed in a marriage that wasn't working because it felt safer than starting over. Maybe now we'll both get a chance to find what we need." Celeste nodded, her expression pensive. "Do you think she'll be okay?" "She's stronger than she lets on," Evan said. "I think, in her own way, this will be a fresh start for her, too." The conversation shifted after that, returning to lighter topics. But as they walked back to the inn later that evening, Evan couldn't help but feel a sense of closure settling over him. It wasn't perfect, and there were still questions he couldn't answer, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward instead of looking back. In the following weeks, Evan and Celeste began to forge a new kind of life together. It was slow and unhurried, built on trust and a shared understanding of the mistakes they'd made. Evan started writing again, not the business memos and speeches he was known for, but personal reflections, capturing the lessons he'd learned and the emotions he'd buried for so long. Celeste encouraged him, her quiet support a constant reminder that he didn't have to face his fears alone. The world outside Fairhaven eventually came calling, as Evan knew it would. His company demanded answers for his prolonged absence, and Neela, true to form, sent a series of carefully worded messages outlining the legalities of their separation. But Evan approached it all with a newfound calm, handling each challenge with the clarity and resolve he had found in Fairhaven. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Evan and Celeste stood on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer felt daunting. Together, they were building something real, something worth fighting for. "Do you regret it?" Celeste asked, her voice barely audible above the sound of the waves. "Regret what?" Evan asked, turning to look at her. "Choosing this," she said, gesturing to the town, the cliffs, and the life they were carving out together. "Choosing me." Evan reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Not for a second." As the stars began to appear overhead, Evan felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he was ready to face them. For the first time in years, he wasn't running away, he was running towards something. And that made all the difference. As the waves crash and the sun sets over the horizon, Evan's story reminds us all of the transformative power of self-awareness and the courage it takes to embrace the unknown. His journey wasn't about escaping, it was about rediscovering who he truly was, even when faced with betrayal, heartbreak, and uncertainty. In the end, Evan chose to step into a future that reflected his values, reclaiming his life on his own terms. Life is full of crossroads, moments where we must decide whether to cling to the familiar or take a leap into the unknown. What would you choose if you were in Evan's shoes? Would you stay tied to the past, or would you risk everything for the promise of something new? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking tales, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.